Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on Senior Victim Advocacy, Resources and Guidance for Victims of Senior Scams. Ellen Cheek with Bay Area Legal Services is going to introduce our speaker today. So take it away, Ellen.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, it's no coincidence that both Attorney General Moody and Attorney Shannon Miller have already mentioned our next presenter. She is a very special advocate. Karen Murillo is an assistant statewide prosecutor in the Florida Attorney General's Office of Statewide Prosecution and serves as the coordinator of the Senior Protection Team. She has prosecuted criminal cases throughout the state of Florida since 2012 and has spent the last 5 years focusing on the prosecution and prevention of exploitation and fraud perpetrated against Florida's seniors and vulnerable adults. Karen's unwavering commitment has been amply demonstrated by her input to legislative initiatives, her work with the Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation Committee of the Elder Law Section, and her outreach across disciplines and throughout the state. Her talent as a prosecutor, combined with her dedication to victims advocacy, make her an ideal speaker for us today. Thank you for being here, Karen. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ellen. I appreciate that. And hi, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to be here and present with you today. I am really looking forward to talking to such a diverse crowd of legal advocates on behalf of our seniors and our vulnerable adults across the state, and talk about how we can work collectively and collaborate and really bring together our collective resources and experiences and disciplines to serve our state's senior population and aging population. So without any further ado, my name is Karen Murillo. As Ellen mentioned, I'm with the Florida Office of the Attorney General and Office of Statewide Prosecution. And I have found in my time working on senior exploitation cases, elder exploitation cases, and crimes against seniors, especially financial crimes, that really there is a dynamic nature that I'm sure that you have seen as well. This intersection of so many various areas and practices and various areas of law and different disciplines. And thankfully, our Attorney General, Ashley Moody, recognized that prior to coming into office, and one of her first efforts in first initiatives announced when she came to office back in 2019 was to establish this Senior Protection Team initiative. And the goal was to focus on these intersections of various types of law and practices, various types of scams having crossover and different government agency regulations, and really trying to create a one-stop shop for senior fraud victims, especially when it comes to making sure that crimes of fraud and scams and exploitation are being handled appropriately by law enforcement, prosecution, being recognized for what it is across the state. So really, Attorney General Ashley Moody, she created this Senior Protection Team to identify the problem and to provide a interagency solution that has been a very robust and amazing response across the state, and is the very reason I have the opportunity of speaking with you here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more in a few minutes about what the Senior Protection Team consists of and how we do that, how we achieve that intra-agency effort. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges that we've identified and that you may already be aware of in terms of responding to types of senior crime issues from a criminal perspective and from just a statewide perspective. Obviously, when we talk about crimes involving seniors and our aging population, identifying those crimes and making sure they're reported is an area that we have a tremendous amount of difficulty with, especially when it comes to seniors self-reporting some of these issues. I don't need to, I'm sure with our various disciplines that are represented here in today's our conference, that I don't need to tell you, you could probably tell me about issues and cases where you've had to really fight to have a victim come forward and report a crime because of this fear or embarrassment, because of this dynamic and crossover with domestic violence types of issues and dealing with familial perpetrators, or a romance scam and the embarrassment and shame that comes from those things, the fear of losing their autonomy, the fear of a family member seeing what has occurred and saying, okay, I'm going to step in now and I'm going to take control. You clearly don't have the ability to do this yourself. So we have a number of obstacles when it comes to even having seniors come forward and identify the scope of what is happening across the state. So we know that seniors are coming forward and advocates on behalf of seniors are coming forward, but we also know that that number that is reflected at the state level is only a fraction of what's actually occurring. We also have this obstacle when it comes to other individuals reporting on behalf of a vulnerable adult or on behalf of a senior, when it comes to these types of cases and bringing it to the attention of law enforcement or other agencies. There's a variety of concerns and biases that may prevent somebody from stepping forward, a lack of education that may prevent somebody from recognizing that they have to report something, such as the reasonable suspicion of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Again, I know that I'm speaking to a variety of individuals and advocates who are very familiar with this dynamic nature and are probably very familiar with mandatory reporting obligations, but I would be remiss if I didn't at least take this opportunity to remind everyone who is here today that when it comes to vulnerable adult cases of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or death that is caused by abuse or neglect or exploitation, we across the state, regardless of profession, but especially legal advocates and financial representatives, we have an obligation to report to the Central Abuse Hotline any reasonable suspicion that this has occurred, is ongoing. Even if it's something that happened far back in the past, we have this obligation. And so making sure that we are, as advocates who are familiar with these obligations, are also passing that information along to our colleagues and others who may not be familiar with that requirement. And we also recognize that there is a need for specialized education and resources when it comes to dealing with these dynamic senior crime issues. Again, we talked about this intersection between the various types of legal disciplines and social service disciplines and nonprofit providers and advocacy groups. And there really is a need similar to what we've seen with child abuse. And as you can see in this picture on the screen, these are, this is a slide of how the child abuse, child advocacy centers help bridge and bring together all the resources into one location to make it easy for children who have been abused or have suffered some form of neglect or other issue. And that's the same concept of what we're trying to do and what we should be doing when it comes to issues impacting seniors. It shouldn't take an expert to know all of the resources, or at least know where to find all of the resources to address crimes against seniors, scams against seniors that maybe don't rise to that level of being a crime, or where it needs a multidisciplinary response of both a civil enforcement and criminal enforcement, and maybe the assistance of social services. So creating these one-stop shops and combining and placing all of these resources into one place is really an important goal and effort that Attorney General Ashley Moody recognized, and in part why the senior protection team was created, but also what we need to be doing across the state for seniors to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts and to identify where there are gaps and blind spots so that we can truly assist victims and give them a robust response and adequately prevent and respond when there is an instance of a crime or a scam. We also have this concern of a continuation of abuse or a re-victimization, even when the abuse or scam has been reported or identified. And this is one of the main reasons why having these multidisciplinary groups and efforts, this dynamic approach to crimes against seniors is so, so important. Because when we look at the familial perpetrators and that overlap with a domestic violence almost kind of analysis, we know that there is likely going to be a reunification of our perpetrator and our victim. So we need to provide resources and education and make sure that we are mirroring what we have seen in other disciplines like domestic violence or child abuse prevention programs. We want to make sure that we are helping these victims, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, which is why these resources and this dynamic approach and a senior specific approach is so, so important. When we talk about scams and impacting seniors, two of the most sinister that I can tell you, I see, and we get reports of it every day across the state and outside of the state, across the nation, are these romance scams and lotto scams. I mean, any type of fraud or exploitation that's committed against a senior or a vulnerable adult is obviously going to be egregious and really frustrate all of us as advocates. But in terms of just the psychological impact of these types of offenses on the victims, when it comes to the romance scams that are perpetrated over the internet through dating sites or Facebook or a variety of social media sites, as we see seniors navigating towards the use of more internet-based services and methods of staying connected with family and meeting other people, we really do see a grooming and a psychological control and manipulation that occurs through these types of scams that ultimately make it very difficult at times to convince a victim that a scam actually is occurring and that they've been victimized. Same thing with lotto scams. We see that based off of the amount of time and effort and grooming that is being spent by these perpetrators with the victim and really getting the victim to believe that they are their friend, that they are on their side, that this is real. It can be very difficult for victims to recognize and admit to themselves that they have been victimized because they can't fathom or recognize the reality. They can't handle the reality that they have spent so much money as part of a scam, or that they have so emotionally invested as well with this other person who they believe is their best friend or their romantic partner or what have you. And these types of crimes in particular require an ongoing response. It's not just an initial conversation with law enforcement or a couple of conversations with a prosecutor, but even after the offense has been handled and prosecuted if possible, that victim, based off of the type of offense, based off of that psychological torment and manipulation, based off of the fact that these scammers share and trade information for these live fish or, vulnerable, susceptible victims, especially for seniors who have cash reserves, we know that they are substantially more likely to be re-victimized and to fall, if not for the same scam again, to be targeted by and to fall for other types of scams that are being perpetrated and targeted against them, which is why that it is so important that we are working together in our local communities and at the state level to provide as much outreach and education opportunity and victim advocacy opportunities as possible that are unique to the types of issues and problems that are targeting and facing seniors specifically. So I've already been talking about kind of this argument and basis for why multidisciplinary teams and this MDT response is so critical. I actually, before joining the Office of the Attorney General, I worked with the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office and the 15th Judicial Circuit, and they have a wonderful elder abuse task force that responds collaboratively between various agencies and groups to make sure that they are providing the seniors and vulnerable adults in their community with the best resources and the most resources as a one-stop shop, and that professionals are also recognizing and learning about what services other counterparts are offering from their agency's role. It's a really helpful and important response to these crimes against seniors issues. And it helps us with standardizing our approach in how we combat these issues, how we collectively, law enforcement, adult protective services, prosecutors, and all of our community providers, how we are teaching and targeting and combating these types of crimes, and also how we can work collaboratively to make sure that we are making these the most effective investigations and prosecutions when they can be investigated and prosecuted. So this multidisciplinary response, it is happening. It has been happening. We've seen it when it comes to, for example, our domestic violence programs. We see these community-based, community-coordinated response teams when it comes to a multidisciplinary network that bridges those different disciplines: criminal justice, victim services and advocacy, prevention and education efforts, as well as helping victims with, one-stop shop in terms of recovery. And that's really a big portion of a big drive of what we are trying to do with the Office of the Attorney General and the Senior Protection Team Initiative, is to really try to bridge those gaps and make sure that we are connecting all of these providers and teams and groups. As I said, Florida is a great example, and I gave you the example of Palm Beach County, but that's just one of many multidisciplinary teams that we already have across the state. We have criminal justice and state attorney's office based advocacy groups and response teams and task forces across the state. And if you're questioning right now, listening to this, I'm not sure if my state attorney's office or my sheriff's office has a team like this, but if they do, I'd be really interested in getting plugged into that and seeing if I can help. Well, reach out to your state attorney's office, reach out to your sheriff's office, inquire, because while we have made great strides and are still making great strides, we still have communities and counties and circuits that have not yet identified that true need to create this multidisciplinary response. And that's something that Attorney General Ashley Moody and Statewide Prosecutor Nick Cox, they have been very active and working very hard to make sure that we are helping our community and circuit partners with the state attorney's offices and county level officials and agencies, making sure that they have the resources and education and capability of creating these teams and response so that we can work in tandem together. We talked about the senior protection team earlier, and I said I was going to get into this more, but the senior protection team is a great example of how collaboration and bridging of gaps between agencies helps get complaints and cases to the appropriate resource or location, making sure that it doesn't fall between the cracks whenever possible. I'll tell you that, and I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about how to report to the senior protection team if you have a case that you'd like to report. But I'll also tell you very frankly and candidly that we relied just as much on local law enforcement and prosecution in the response to this, because this is not a one size fits all. You know, this is a multidisciplinary and multi-agency response that is required to just the sheer volume of what we're talking about here. So if you haven't reported something to local law enforcement, if you haven't already reported something to Adult Protective Services that meets that mandatory reporting requirement, we're going to make sure that those steps have been taken too, because ultimately we are trying to put together all of the resources and making sure that we are utilizing most effectively the resources we have. We, through the senior protection team, have also been focusing on, and this is another example of the value of this multidisciplinary approach. We've been focusing on our training and education opportunities and efforts when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to prosecutors. We've also been focusing on our education and outreach when it comes to the community and seniors and senior care providers. We're trying to get the word out in terms of what scams look like, how to identify it, what trends we're seeing at the state level, and things that we're hearing about from our federal counterparts, and helping law enforcement have all the resources that they need in order to effectively investigate and respond to these cases when they're reported. As with prosecutors, helping them understand how the law has changed and really adapted, and it still has room to grow for sure, but we have made significant strides when it comes to identifying what exploitation actually consists of, how we can prosecute that, what the elements are, and making it something that is an achievable prosecution and goal. Some examples of MDTs that I haven't already talked about, like that state attorney's office task force or work group. We have other MDTs across the state that maybe are senior specific or are a specific crime focus, like a fraud work group or a abuse work group with law enforcement. And if you are interested in this, contact your local sheriff's office and your local state attorney's office. We really are trying to make sure that these responses across the state to the issues that you are seeing as a professional, that we are giving you the tools and the resources and the guidance on how to be a best advocate for your clients or your the individuals you are serving in whatever capacity you may be serving them. A couple of examples that I wanted to show you of just kind of the success of what MDTs bring to the table and how effective they can be. One success and example of where I believe in and know I have at least a few of our legal aid organizations across the state represented on today's webinar, and hopefully have representation from all over the state on this from legal services. But this injunction for protection against exploitation, if you're not familiar with it already, I hope that you become familiar with it. I hope that after today's presentation, you go and you research this statute in particular, because it is a tremendous resource, and it is something that is the result of this multidisciplinary effort and the hard work of people who are invested advocates on behalf of seniors and vulnerable victims. Like my friend Ellen Cheek, who introduced me kindly earlier, I'll give her a shout out and say that she was tremendously important and part of this effort that created this injunction, which is modeled after a domestic violence injunction type of process and proceeding. And the reason that I point to this in particular, it's not just a successful example of what we as MDTs, if we put our minds together and our resources together and identify problems together, how we can work together to solve those problems, which this statute very much is. But it's also a perfect example of how law enforcement and prosecutors are very eager to see this injunction utilized, but it's something that we as prosecutors don't have the standing or the capability of filing on a victim's behalf. And this is where you come in for our private private attorneys who are elder law attorneys, and for our legal service providers, our pro bono services providers, we really do need these community counterparts to bring victims who are in the process of being exploited to these legal resources to help them file for these injunctions. Because the capabilities of these injunctions and the civil process may be able to prevent somebody from losing their home, being kicked out, and being homeless. It may pull a perpetrator out of the home to prevent future harm from occurring, while the criminal investigation is catching up to speed so that we can make an arrest. It also really is important when it comes to, once money is gone, and I'm sure I don't have to convince any of you on this call who are familiar with these scams and financial fraud issues, but once the money has left the account, 9 times out of 10, it's gone. Even speaking as a prosecutor who, we have an obligation under Florida law to seek restitution on behalf of victims in a criminal case. And that may be months after the crime has occurred, it may be years after the crime has occurred. And typically speaking, just based off of the experience that I've seen in prosecuting these cases, typically our perpetrators, they're not just taking that money and investing it so that it can be recalled later in a restitution hearing. They're taking it and spending it in real time. So when it comes to these injunction processes and this injunction tool, we rely on our civil counterparts and partners in our communities to help guide victims through this process so that we can potentially freeze the assets where they're at. We could maybe get those assets returned to the victim before a criminal prosecution is even brought. So this is really a great example, I think, of not just, like I said, the product of a multidisciplinary team, but also how we can collaborate and work on this together. So for all my legal service providers who are on the call who are not familiar with this, please see me after, because I am very eager to tell you more about this and how we can work collaboratively on this and really work together to bridge those gaps. Another success example of this multidisciplinary approach and this dynamic approach to senior issues, in case you were not already familiar with this legislation that passed this year, we've got our Senate Bill 1344, the Protection of Elderly Persons and Disabled Adults. And this was really a combined effort between civil legal advocates, elder law attorneys, on behalf of vulnerable seniors, and the Attorney General's office, and this criminal prosecution perspective, and the combined efforts that identified gaps in where we could do better, where we can do more. I'm not going to go through this as through all of the achievements of this legislation, but a couple of important and interesting outcomes to keep in mind. Because of this dynamic nature, it was recognized that we've got people who are being convicted of exploitation, who have taken so much and taken advantage of a vulnerable senior, especially one who lacks capacity towards the end of life. And they may be convicted of that. There may even be some restitution ordered. And at the end of the day, that victim passes away, and their will, before this exploitation ever occurred, was written so that the perpetrator, who's a family member, was going to benefit. Well, now there's legislation in place that says that that conviction is going to trump that will, that conviction, unless the victim is capacitated and benefits that perpetrator is not going to be able to benefit financially on the back end from having taken advantage of our victim on the front end. And that's a really important and interesting area of how this civil and criminal process and civil and criminal disciplines worked together to achieve a really important legislative achievement here. Attorney General Ashley Moody was an integral part of and really championed this bill And because of that, we've also expanded the protections criminally for vulnerable seniors and elderly persons when it comes to criminalizing and going after social isolation. Again, I'm not going to go through all the parts of this bill, and I want you to be familiar with it. But because I know that there are at least a couple of prosecutors who are on this call, I will put in the plug and say that this legislation, which passed through both the Senate and House and is currently pending governor's signature, it actually creates a new form of abuse for the unreasonable social isolation, the unjustified social isolation of a vulnerable victim from their family members. So that will hopefully allow for us as providers and law enforcement to intervene sooner, to make an arrest before that all the financial exploitation has occurred or before the irreparable harm has occurred. And it also criminalizes something that previously was a blind spot in our exploitation cases. It criminalizes and captures this tampering with a vulnerable victim's testamentary intent. So fraudulently creating a will or modifying and tampering with a will that's in existence. Now that conduct is criminalized as a form of exploitation, whereas previously it did not appear to be captured because it was something that affected a future interest in property, not something while the vulnerable victim was alive. So some very exciting examples of how this multidisciplinary effort and approach identifies gaps and figures out how to civilly and criminally fix this from a legislative perspective and a policy perspective. All right, so I've talked your ear off. Hopefully I have underscored the value and the purpose and need for these multidisciplinary responses. So let's talk about some of the resources that are available. And I would be remiss if I didn't at least tell you how the senior protection team works and what this looks like. So our senior protection team, you can file a complaint online, over the phone. You can even mail in a complaint to the Attorney General's office. And it's really designed, like I said, for fraud or deceptive or unfair business practices, but financial crimes that are being committed against seniors who are having difficulty having that criminally investigated or prosecuted, or for whatever reason are not sure of where to turn to next resource-wise. So it's our age requirement is that these victims are 60 years of age or older, or that the consumer is 60 years of age or older. And we're really trying to get all of those practices and scams and financial predatory schemes that are targeting these individuals because of their age. And in terms of what the senior protection team does, we work in tandem with other agencies and internally within the state, within the Attorney General's office, with our specific intra-agency efforts. We do work with local law enforcement, like I said. We work directly with Adult Protective Services and local state attorneys' offices. We work with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to make sure that these cases are being criminally investigated, and when appropriate, have the Office of Statewide Prosecution even step in and prosecute these cases when appropriate and it meets our jurisdictional requirements. One thing to keep in mind, I said earlier, it's important that I at least touch upon the mandatory reporting obligations that we all have under Florida law. And the filing a complaint with the senior protection team does not satisfy that obligation, but we are, in addition to hopefully yourself, we are also making sure that Adult Protective Services and Department of Children and Families are aware of these when it meets those mandatory reporting requirements. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not to be used in lieu of local law enforcement, but it is meant to augment and enhance and really make sure that we are getting those cases that are falling between the cracks, that are not being identified or not being handled, to see if there is a different avenue or a different approach that may be taken. I mentioned that it's comprised of several intra-agency components, and that's the Office of Statewide Prosecution, our Consumer Protection Division, and our Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, as well as our Office of Citizen Services, which handles the bulk of this intake process. The Office of Statewide Prosecution, you don't need to memorize our jurisdictional requirements, and rest assured that we are also working very closely with our partner state attorney's offices locally to help resource-wise whenever possible in getting these cases prosecuted, even if it is not through our office. But we are making sure that we are bridging those gaps for criminal cases, that they are getting to the right criminal investigative agency and ultimately being reviewed by the correct prosecuting agency as well. The Consumer Protection Division is another really imperative part of this process and another underscoring example of how this is a multidisciplinary approach, because they're handling the civil enforcement side of this when it comes to businesses who are businesses or business owners that are violating the Florida Deceptive and Unfair Trade Practices Act. You try saying that 5 times fast. But really, they are able to intervene civilly with injunctions through mediation. They're able to help recover financially on behalf of seniors where there is a systemic or systematic approach to a large target of senior population in our state. They're not typically going to be handling single one-on-one individual complaints, but where there is identified a trend of a systemic issue and practice where these businesses, and we've seen them, we've seen the home repair companies and others that have really spent a lot of effort targeting our senior populations and convincing them to purchase things that they don't actually need and overcharging them and being deceptive in what seniors are signing. And we're going after those bad actors through our Consumer Protection Division. And in terms of the individual cases, we do assist on those too, though it may not be handled directly by our Consumer Protection Division. Our Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, I always get that mixed up. They are another really important part of this, and they are an example of a civil and criminal enforcement division. And they are very, very helpful and are willing to work with local law enforcement and prosecution, and they work closely with adult protective services in making sure that these instances of patients who are in long-term care facilities and nursing homes and assisted living facilities who suffer from abuse, neglect, or exploitation, that they're going after those providers and those perpetrators and making sure that the individuals who are in these facilities are not going ignored or unnoticed. And we work very closely with Seniors versus Crime. If you're not familiar with this resource already, you definitely should be. I've got a list here of all the counties in which you already have offices and locations, and I believe that Seniors versus Crime is actually expanding, so they may be coming to a town near you. But even if you don't see your county or your local area listed here, that does not mean that Seniors versus Crime does not provide support and assistance to vulnerable victims in your area or to victims in your area. They help consumers and seniors, and they don't just help seniors, but it is an example, and what it was based upon is this idea of seniors helping seniors who have been victimized by some sort of fraud or scam or deceptive practice. And they can help mediate and hopefully recover some sort of financial recovery or achieve some sort of fair result and outcome on behalf of these seniors. If it's not a criminal case, it's not appropriate for criminal investigation or doesn't meet the requirements for a criminal investigation. So keep Seniors versus Crime in mind and rest assured that we are working very closely with them as this special project of the Florida Attorney General's office and partner with our agency. We work very closely with them on these senior complaint issues as well. And sometimes we'll refer things through our senior protection team to them as well. A couple other resources to keep in mind, especially federally speaking. If you're not familiar with this already, please do take the time to check out these resources on the Department of Justice Elder Justice Initiative website. They have great examples of all kinds of outreach and education campaigns, as well as how to start a multidisciplinary team if there isn't one already in your area. I should also take a moment and say that part of what the Attorney General's office has been working very hard on doing, in addition to bridging the agencies that are working together for meeting the needs of senior victims and handling senior crime investigations and prosecutions, we're also making sure that we are connecting with the providers and the task forces and work groups, these MDTs that already exist across the state, that are doing important work and having resources already devoted to community outreach, education, prevention, identification, and response. We want to make sure that we are plugging in with those groups too. We've identified many across the state and are working very closely with many across the state, but I'm sure that there are representatives on this call who are probably aware of one or more work groups or task forces that are coming to mind that, oh, that would actually be really helpful if they were aware of the trends that we're seeing across the state, if they were plugged in for updates on crime prevention techniques and things that we at the state level are doing, or even education and training opportunities as they become available. So if you are aware of a multidisciplinary team or group or effort in your area, please, by all means, reach out to me, let me know about them, because I would love to connect and make sure that we are supporting those groups and initiatives whenever possible across the state. Another really important resource to keep in mind for our advocates on the phone, not on the phone, on today's webinar. I say on the phone because everybody has kindly turned off their cameras and I can only see my face. So I have no idea how many people are listening, but I know we have people who are responding to and kind of on the front lines of these cases. And sometimes whether or not a criminal investigation can ensue, you're really looking for all of the places that you can go to make sure you are helping this senior with their case, and also hopefully preventing another senior from becoming victim to the same perpetrator or scam in the future. And that's where the FTC's fraud reporting system and consumer sentinel network is really important, and something that I would encourage you to become familiar with if you don't already utilize it. When it comes to these scams that we're seeing through the internet or through email phishing or through robocalls or government impersonator scams over the phone, these voice over IP calls, other types of fraud committed through like our communications efforts, and those scams I mentioned earlier, they're truly sinister ones with these romance scams and these lotto frauds. We know that these are organized criminal networks that are facilitating and committing most of these crimes. And so in order to help target and identify those perpetrators, it is really beneficial if everyone reports to a singular source or a singular place all the information that they're able to, even if you're not sure it meets that, you're not sure you've got enough for a crime to be reported, or you're not sure that you've got enough there that it's going to actually be investigated. Maybe the person who you're helping actually identified and recognized halfway through the phone call that it actually was a fraud. Reporting it to this network actually helps us across the nation, because law enforcement and prosecutors in each state are able to access this information and see what the trends are, see if there are similar scammers or similar types of crimes occurring elsewhere. It helps us target common perpetrators and identify common perpetrators that maybe are being already investigated and prosecuted in another jurisdiction. And it also helps federally for us to target who are the primary bad actors, where these calls and scams are really originating from, so we can try to go after those at both the state and federal level. The same approach and information when it comes to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. This is another valuable and important place to report. Unlike the Consumer Sentinel Network, which is available for all law enforcement agencies to participate in and obtain that information from the Consumer Sentinel Network, kind of a reciprocal capability. This one is really just putting the information before the FBI for possibly an intervention and immediate investigation response. But if not, it's categorized and analyzed and maintained as a part of their system so that they can identify these large scale international perpetrators and common themes so they can go after some of these individuals that we see abroad who are committing these offenses. And I know it says here the Internet Crime Complaint Center, and you probably are thinking, well, why are you talking about these phone call scams? But keep in mind that most of these phone solicitations and phone fraud, phone scams, you know that they're spoofing or putting a fake phone number in the caller ID, or making it appear that they're calling from a local area when they're actually nowhere in the state of Florida. We know that they're using this voice over IP technology, and that places this within an internet crime consideration and scope. So if you're seeing those types of cases and you're wondering, where can I report this to in addition to notifying local law enforcement, these are some really great resources and places where the information is utilized. It will matter in the long run. It may not involve a direct result for your particular client or that specific victim, but ultimately it does help in our prevention and enforcement efforts globally. Speaking of this response, when we talk about local law enforcement versus kind of this federal approach, one thing that I really want to make sure you are familiar with, and as advocates that you're familiar with, and that law enforcement, I spend some time talking with our law enforcement agencies about this as well, in terms of kind of a how to respond triage, if you will, for these types of cases. If you have a situation where a senior has already sent money through a wire fraud, through a wire transfer, that they've done some sort of payment online through their bank. And we're talking about something that's occurred within 24 to 72 hours that's being reported. The FBI is actually able to recall some of these transactions when they're reported early enough, even if the finances have left the bank from the victim's banking perspective. They work very closely with banking institutions to help recall some of these international scheme funds. They work very closely with local and domestic banking financial institutions, as well as international financial institutions. So if you are hearing this as an advocate, that somebody recognizes they've been scammed and it's early on, the first thing that you should do is contact law enforcement. You should call your emergency services. But they and you should keep in mind that if reported to the FBI early enough, this can also potentially be reversed. They've had a lot of successes, especially when it's been reported within a 24 to 48 hour period of getting that money back. Similarly, the United States Postal Inspector has been very, very important and helpful, and they've been great partners on these lotto scam cases in particular. But any kind of financial fraud where seniors are being asked to send things through the mail system, whether it's gift cards or actual cash or other electronic items that are being used as a form of currency. These types of cases, if reported early enough, the United States Postal Inspector can actually intervene and grab that package before the delivery is completed to avoid the loss that ultimately, because once that package has been delivered, we know once the money is gone, it's gone. Especially when we're talking about cash, there's no way of tracking that ultimately. So it's really important to keep these resources in mind if you've got something that's being reported in real time to you as an advocate. Also remember, keep in mind for that mandatory reporting requirement, but also as a resource. Remember to report to Adult Protective Services or to the Department of Children and Families Central Abuse Hotline, because they are able to work with law enforcement and work with these other providers. They are able to sometimes provide emergency assistance and or notify the appropriate agency that can provide that emergency assistance or intervention. So remember that they are both a resource as well as a mandatory reporting obligation for you. And consider if there are other federal or state regulatory agencies applicable. And that's, I have the IC3 and the Consumer Sentinel Network kind of reiterated there, but the SEC and other federal-based providers have also been working very closely with state agencies and local law enforcement agencies to provide as a quick and hopefully mediate and correct a financial issue before the money is gone if it's reported soon enough. Also keep in mind, if you are interested in looking for some other educational opportunities, or maybe you're looking for what types of information should you be providing to your clients, or should you be providing to seniors in your area, the FTC has a number of great free printable resources and guides on elder fraud prevention. They describe a lot of these scams and issues like the money mule scam, which if you're not familiar with that in particular, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that, but it's a really important one to make sure seniors recognize that if they're participating in these schemes, that they're actually possibly committing money laundering in the process and helping launder money for these organized criminal networks. The National Center on Law and Elder Rights, National Center on Elder Abuse, they have great education opportunities for professionals, legal professionals in particular, but not just. And they also have some great materials available to educate seniors and resources available for seniors. For advocates in particular who are interested and qualify to become a member or a partnership or organization or person with the National Adult Protective Services Association, they do provide a scam advice call monthly. It's primarily for adult protective service investigators and victim advocates, but it is with the goal of educating and identifying these scams that are occurring and what the resources are in response. That romance scam that I mentioned earlier and the lotto scam that I mentioned earlier, both of those have been discussed several times in these calls, and the resources that are available and how to develop even more resources in your area if you're interested in that. And if you are not already listening to this and you have an interest in learning about the nature of scams against seniors, but scams generally, AARP has an amazing podcast called The Perfect Scam, which does a great job explaining how these crimes occur. Too frequently, we in a law enforcement capacity or in other capacities have a difficulty understanding how could somebody fall for this? How is it that they voluntarily gave their money in this or thought that this was legitimate? And these podcasts do a really great job in showing just how manipulative and truly skilled and you know, the expertise that's required by these scam artists and how many people are falling victim to it, not just seniors in many cases. But these are some additional resources to keep in mind. If you have specific questions for me, I'm going to open up for questions in just a moment for anybody who's on today's webinar. But if you want to follow up and ask any particular questions, ask for resources or who the best, not best, but who the community providers are in your area, anything along those lines, feel free to reach out to me. My name, again, Karen Murillo, that's my email, and our office address here in Tallahassee. This is also the information on where to report to the senior protection team if you have a case involving a senior who has fallen victim to some sort of scam or fraud. And but you have already reported it to local law enforcement and adult protective services if it meets that vulnerable adult criteria. But you're looking for some additional guidance and assistance on this, keep us in mind. And with that, let me catch my breath and see if we have any questions. Ellen, did we?
Karen, I'll
Yes.
read them so you can get a drink of water there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have one, which is, they refer to it as an FYI, Ms. Murillo. I encountered a senior who, after identity was stolen, was telephoned by a person who identified himself as an assistant attorney general, tried to persuade the senior that she did not need to go to the police to file a report. She assisted her in contacting the attorney general and ascertaining that the man who called her was not affiliated with the attorney general.
Thank you for bringing that example up. And that's actually a really important point that I didn't go into, but that you guys should all be aware of as advocates. And part of that re-victimization part that I mentioned before, we see a number of victims, especially on these romance scams and lotto scams, which, as I've said, are very manipulative, very skilled, very sinister. We frequently will see if they believe, the scam artist believes that, you know, the victim has identified that this is a fraud, they've identified that this is a crime, they will then have someone else call back from their same group or network and pretend to be a victim advocate, pretend to work for an attorney general's office or from a federal institution or agency, and pretend to be assisting the victim, while all the while they're obtaining additional identification information that they can use to open up credit cards and obtain financial information and bleed the victim's account dry. So we see that frequently. And if you see that, if you encounter that, please report that. Please report that to the Attorney General's office through the Senior Protection Team. Please report that to the Consumer Sentinel Network, to the IC3. These resources are I'm not just giving them to you for, you know, for fun. These are really important places to report these to. And if it is somebody that is an imposter scam where they are pretending to be a state agency, also keep in mind that at the state level, we have inspector general's offices for each of these state agencies, the Attorney General's office included, and they do review and go after individuals who try to utilize the name and authority of their agency fraudulently. So that's yet another example of a resource available to you. I know that wasn't a question, but hopefully that was responsive and helpful. Did we have any other questions that came in? Kathy's not saying anything else.
Wait, excuse me. There is one other one.
Yes.
I spoke with the senior whose Social Security number was stolen and who was informed by a Social Security Administration phone rep that she could not apply for a new Social Security number, notwithstanding the fact that I had identified to her an official Social Security Administration FAQ, which states that new Social Security numbers will be assigned to individuals who continue to be disadvantaged by the theft of their Social Security number. It would be helpful if the Attorney General would collaborate with SSA, Social Security Administration, to ensure that seniors are not thwarted when they apply for new Social Security numbers.
That's an excellent point. And keeping in mind kind of the separation between the state and federal levels here, we don't regulate and we can't enforce the federal agencies' requirements, but we do work very closely with our federal counterparts, not just within SSA, but within the Department of Justice and other invested parties that and agencies that will rally and assist on these types of issues. So when you have an example like this of something where you're not getting the result and you know that per policy, there is another avenue available that's just being ignored for whatever reason, you can bring this to our attention through we can sometimes help through the senior protection team. I can certainly help in an individual capacity with these MDTs that we work on, and also you as advocates in your communities in partnership with these MDTs. If you work with these groups and organizations that are going after the scams, and you have these federal counterparts that are parts of these MDTs as well, you can work with them very closely to maybe get an answer directly on why this isn't happening, if policies have changed, or if they can give you any context as to why this particular victim's not getting the result requested.
All right, thank you. We did have a couple of inquiries about folks wanting a copy of your PowerPoint.
Sure, not a problem.
What I said is that we'll post it at your session in the files as soon as we can. And there aren't any other questions. And so I would really like to thank you for being a part of this conference. Everybody got a lot of good information I think that they'll be able to use, and encourage people to collaborate with other people involved in the same causes. And one last comment, which is thank you so much from one of our attendees. So thank you.
Thank you guys very much. And please don't hesitate to reach out. You have my contact information. If I can be of assistance to you, I would love to be. And I'm always eager to hear more about what you're doing in your community and your area of the state. So please look me up and let me know, because I'm interested. I want to help and support you all in the important work and efforts you're doing as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you at 4 o'clock.